Anti-Semitic hate's reached record levels, according to a Jewish charity, and we're going to be speaking to them a little bit later on the programme.
More than 4,000, yes, my friends, 4,000 anti-Jewish hate incidents were recorded in the UK in 2023, according to the Community Security Trust. We'll have the guy behind that later on. All of this on the back of those horrendous October the 7th Hamas attacks. They are being blamed upon this rise.
Well, joining us now is Jonathan Sacerdoti, a Jewish journalist who campaigns against anti-Semitism alongside The Sun's defence editor Jerome Starkey. Thank you both so much. Jerome, we'll start with you. These figures are so stark. From your experience, what's happened since October the 7th, particularly for the Jewish community to say, actually, in some cases, we don't feel very safe?
Anti-Semitism has been something that Jews have got used to over time, but I think that what we've seen in recent months is just so much worse. And I think it's been so pervasive at every level of society. We've seen it affect Jewish people in universities. They have fears about the police. They have fears about the government. They have fears about the opposition, with Labour MPs now dropping like flies again, even under Keir Starmer. They have fears about trade unions. I've seen an exodus of people from the National Union of Journalists, even because of what they see as a tolerance of anti-Semitism. There has been a doubt about the press on Jews. There's been theatres with a comedian driving out a Jewish audience member for not saluting a Palestinian flag. The courts, we've seen a judge now who apparently liked a comment against Israel in a case where he found guilty protesters for supporting Hamas and then let them off from punishment. It's gone through just about every part of British society. And I think that that's why, at the moment, most British Jewish people I know are utterly afraid of this massive rise in anti-Semitism. It's not, let's say, the normal rise that we're used to when there's strife in the Middle East. This is so much worse. And even the fact that I can say the normal rise is itself depressing. There should be no normal rise. There should be no anti-Semitism.
Can I separate, and lovely to see you again, my friend, it's been too long. Can I separate what's going on in the Middle East? I know it's said that the rise in anti-Semitism has prevailed since October the 7th. But if I can just put that to one side of the moment, because I've got different theories about that. Why do we live in a country, do you think, and I said this yesterday and it wasn't very popular, and I'll keep saying it because I believe it, because that's what a democracy is, right? Why is it we are so quite rightly appalled by racism against the black community, against the Asian community, against the Muslim, and quite rightly, by the way, I think any racism is abhorrent. But why are you able to sit on this show and go, it's a bigger rise than usual? Why is anti-Semitism, which is racist, by the way, and I will keep saying, why is that more acceptable? Why is that something that apparently Jewish people have to accept? That, to me, is as abhorrent.
It is abhorrent, and it's depressing, and it's tragic. And for Jewish people like myself, who, by the way, are Brits, I'm born and raised here, I have every right not to be a victim of terrorism, a victim of racism or terrorism at that. And I think that it's a very good question. It's not just here, though. It's across the whole world. We've seen calls for gas the Jews outside the Sydney Opera House, and then the police there saying, no, they were actually saying, where are the Jews? We've seen the heads of universities, leading Ivy League universities in the States, unable to call out anti-Semitism properly. It's spreading everywhere. I read in a report yesterday about a ski rental place in Davos saying that they won't serve Jews anymore. This sort of stuff has become pervasive across the world, across Europe, across the UK. And I know that British people, the majority of British people, don't want to tolerate this and don't feel that it's justified. But I think that it's time that ordinary British people, all the people at home, need to actually speak out more frequently when they see this sort of thing going on around them. There are very few Jews in Great Britain, something like 271,000. We're less than 0.5% of the population. So many people have never met one of us. But we're ordinary people like everybody else.
One of us, though, and to me, that's again wrong.
All these areas of life that I've said have been where there's been a rise in anti-Semitism.
The other day about the bloke in the supermarket with the loud thing. He stood there and he's going, don't buy any goods that are from Israel. It's all about the Jews. I mean, that is... I am not... I'll say it again because people get, oh, what about... Yeah, I don't like any racism at all. I think it's abhorrent. But it is not fair that this is acceptable,
Well, I just wanted to say as well, that, Jeremy, that Jews are not only being targeted in all these areas and walks of life, but they've also contributed extraordinarily in all these walks of life because Jewish people have integrated into British richer society. We've been very lucky to be treated well in Britain, but we need to stand up against this as a nation, not just as Jewish people. The whole nation needs to stand up against it. In all those areas I listed, Jewish people have made extraordinary, disproportionate contributions to British life. And so I think it's time that the rest of Britain stood up and speaks out when they see it. They disapprove of it quietly, but what they need to do is speak out. I don't like these sort of woke words like allyship, but it's time for a bit of allyship for Jewish people.
I will.
Why do you think that is people aren't doing that? Are they scared?
Yes, I think people are scared.
Of what?
I think people are scared of a backlash. People are scared of entering into a problem where part of the anti-Semitism problem is to do with extremist Islam. I think that they're afraid of what might happen to them if they speak out against things like that. But it's not just Islam, it's on the left, it's on the right, it's at the extremes of all sorts of parts of society.
Can we make a point as well, that extremity, and I think it's a really important point, you know, when people are criticising other cultures, races, religions, there are extremist parts of every, but that is not in any way and shouldn't make people think that every part of that being is in that way. That's a really important point to make.
I have good Muslim friends who are with me foursquare in this fight against anti-Semitism. In fact, more than many people who have no faith or religion that they profess to follow. So I think it's vital that people who are against this, people who disapprove of our graveyards being smashed up, of Jewish heads of schools being told that their throat will be slit because there's a jihad, of all these sorts of attacks that are taking place on Jews, they need to speak out. They need to help us. They need to tell us they're with us. They need to complain to the politicians. They need to complain to the police. They need to complain to the BBC. They need to complain to the media. They need to complain to their bosses. They need to stand up for us because it's not just our problem. Our society is rotten to have any kind of racism in it, especially Jew hate, from my perspective, but any kind of hatred. And therefore, it's vital, it's incumbent upon all of us that we must stand up against any kind of discrimination and prejudice for our own sakes, not for Jewish people's sakes, for society's sake.
Completely.
We've lost our moral compass on this.
Completely.
In the studio with us is Jerome Starkey, defence editor at The Sun. Jerome, thank you so much. A lot of this stems, they've said that there's been a real increase in anti-Semitic events, attacks, instances of violence ever since October the 7th. Remind us, we all know what happened, but remind us what happened and how sort of the narrative has changed somewhat to where we are today, where there are headlines now saying new ceasefire vote ramps up the pressure on Starmer, and also the international community looking at Netanyahu saying we need to really think about your actions.
Yeah, of course. Well, I mean, we'll all remember on October 17th, the Hamas terrorists launched a surprise attack, charging through the fence between the Gaza Strip and Israel, killing some 1,200 people in Israel. And that, since then, Israel has launched a huge offensive inside Gaza. They've effectively, starting from the north, broadly speaking, taken control of Gaza City, ordering hundreds of thousands, over 1 million civilians to move south. They've repeated a similar sort of offensive in Khan Yunis, and now the last sort of enclave of many of these civilian refugees inside Gaza is in Rafah in the south, near the border, or on the border with Egypt. Israel appears to be planning for a final push to clear that area, to try and crush what remains of Hamas in that area. That has caused growing international concern.
Understandably.
Because that is the last place that these civilians who are not Hamas are hiding out. And that includes, you know, women and children, people who have left their homes, crowding into, the remnants of what is left, where they, crowding into many families living in one room in pretty awful and difficult conditions. Overnight, we've seen the leaders of 3 countries, New Zealand, Canada and Australia, share grave concerns about this offensive, which they say would be catastrophic. We've also heard our own Foreign Secretary David Cameron urging Israel to think very carefully about this offensive, not going quite as far as the Antipodean and the Canadian nations. Of course, Australia, Canada, New Zealand are 3 members of the Five Eyes intelligence sharing alliance. So they will be seeing much of the same intelligence reporting on this conflict as Britain and America.
Jerome, can I ask you something? We've spoken to many military people over the last few days. I stand full square with what my friend has just said, James. But I want to ask you something more specifically, militarily. Absolutely accept that what happened on the 7th of October Israel has a right to deal with that genocide. But there are 1 million people, in basic layman's terms, who have been forced by the IDF and Israel to move from north to south so they could eradicate Hamas. Khan Yunis on the way. And now these people in the south, where are they supposed to go? The global condemnation, which was rightly aimed specifically October the 7th and gave Israel this right, is changing because people are quite rightly saying, what about these million women and children? Now, Hamas, we know, is within that. How on earth, militarily, did you get rid of these battalions without massive bloodshed that nobody surely wants? Nobody.
That is the concern, and that is exactly the concern that's been raised by a number of international statesmen, saying it appears impossible to fight a military offensive in those sort of conditions. Certainly, a military offensive, which uses large ordnance like the airstrikes we've seen so far. It's very hard to drop a bomb in an area with over 1 million people living in it without killing civilians. Now, of course, there remains this ongoing question of proportionality, whether or not the actions taken to destroy Hamas are proportionate to the military aims, whether those civilian casualties can be justified. And it's a brutal calculation about human lives, but it's worth remembering that the current death toll, according to the authorities inside Gaza, the Palestinian authorities, is that more than 28,000 people have died as a result of this offensive to crush Hamas.
Gentlemen, thank you so much. Jonathan, Jerome, a pleasure to have you on. Thank you for coming in so early this morning. Thank you.